section. So I'm Alina. I'm a senior delivery and product leader. I used to work a lot within B2B, B2C, and D2C sectors with many automotive, media, consumer goods, retail, also industries. As part of many of my various roles, I delivered lots of digital transformations, and I worked a lot within delivering transformations across mobile apps, e-commerce platforms, CRM migrating from on-prem to cloud, reducing operational cost, and also increasing customer engagements, and lots of other items involved as part of it. So I guess we can start. Many thanks for joining us today. I hope you will learn something new. So, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Thanks. Yeah, looks
Yeah.
good.
So today we are going to discuss about driving the change and how to achieve the success within the digital transformation. So first of all, we will dive into what are the biggest challenges in the digital transformation. We will discuss some of the science of the DINE projects and programs, and then we'll go kind of through all of the delivery steps, how to address it to be successful in digital transformations. So starting with the biggest digital transformation challenges. So digital transformation is the process of integrating digital technologies in all or many areas of business. So has any one of you has done already any digital transformations? What challenges you've faced? And if not, what do you think is the biggest challenge? Any thoughts, ideas?
I guess resource availability might be a constraint as well.
Yep. Anything else from anyone?
The program I'm working on at the moment is very difficult to test anything efficiently because of the kind of technology landscape that we're working in. So it takes a long time to do seemingly simple, in inverted commas, changes because of that. And also sometimes it's difficult to to obtain like a really clear direction and priorities far enough in advance, because the business rightfully changes its mind quite often about what things are going to be of best benefit, and we have to be quite agile in response to that.
Yeah. Thank you. That's good comments. Anything else from anyone? So usually one of like the top of the challenge, obviously there can be many different challenges, but the top of the challenges usually which we see is resistance to change, budget constraints, because all of the digital transformations usually cost a lot of money, and I will say they start probably from 1 million and can go to 10 millions or even more, depends on the change. A lot of the legacy systems and lots of companies are moving into the digital transformations for the reason of replacing them, and it can be very difficult to replace them, especially all at once. As part of it, there's also lots of security issues or siloed decisions, which is also very common. So when some departments, they take more of the ownership of the change, and then they kind of like working more in the silos and not across the whole company organizations, which then can create a lot of the issues because the change will actually impact lots of different departments as well. And as already mentioned, also, yeah, the flexibility, the speed of implementation. So because they're so long and usually they will last for several years, the business will change in the meantime, the landscape will change, technology will change, so it's difficult sometimes to plan such a long time for such a long time, and you need to be prepared and be very flexible to understand the business needs, the customer needs, and to adapt to it very fast. So to my surprise, as I learned through time, actually the biggest change for all of the digital transformations is the employee resistance and lack of management support. So apparently that 70% of the change initiatives are failing because of that, which is really substantial number. And it's really important for business to focus basically from the start how you're going to implement this change. So I know just through all of my clients, it's very often where the kind of the considerations, how actually the employees are going to consider it, is only taken around like the deployment or during the delivery stage. So it's not really a priority for the business, but then once it's actually launched, that's where the companies are really struggling, and because the employee resistance is very high, especially if people used to work with completely different technologies, and some of them used to work with maybe some technologies for 10 or even 20 years, and now you're giving them something which is completely different. Some of the technologies like Oracle or maybe Salesforce, for example, they're very complex. It's very difficult to learn them in the last like few weeks, where usually it's very common for companies to plan. So there was basically no news at all for the whole business that something is coming. And then eventually in the last few weeks, like you will see that, oh, now we need to get some people to move into training. And then some of the people feel very surprised or pressured by this. Some of them are not ready because, again, you need to allocate a lot of the time, and few weeks or even few months might not be enough for people to actually buy in and to understand how it works and how to use it and how it will actually help them. So you need to spend a lot of time basically on facilitating team enablement to ensure that users are set up for success basically from the start, when you just started the discussions and the implementation of the digital transformations. So then people can make the most out of the tools and technologies that you're basically providing to them. So I noticed that with many of my clients, that many of the issues were actually occurring after the successful launch. So once you think, oh, now we can move all of our people away and you have more time to actually move on to something else. We had a lot of questions from the customers. They didn't know how to use something, how it works. Basically, there was a lot of kind of frustrations, worrying, a lot of questions. And sometimes it can lead to major issues. So with one of my clients, for example, one of the employees, they were very new to the technology. Obviously it was very complex, so they didn't understand how to use it. And by mistake, they removed absolutely all of the products from the website. So we had to basically then find some backups to do the backups, but for a few hours basically they couldn't sell anything at all until we did the backup, and still they lost some of the orders which we were not able to restore. So it's really important to basically train people well in advance before you're going to deliver anything, so they will be more happy to assist you with this change, but also they are ready and they will feel comfortable with it. So also based on it, only around 30% of digital transformations are successful. So many of them not creating any value at all or very limited values. The targets are also not met. So very often, which I also noticed within my clients with whom I work, that when you come to the meeting, they struggle to really give you explicit like what objectives we want to achieve. So they know high-level idea what they want to do. But sometimes if you start digging it into more exact, can you give exact like objective, what is like one or two areas like which is the most critical for you that you absolutely need to deliver? That's where sometimes it's difficult for business to pinpoint it. And they might come to you with 10 or 20 different objectives, but then it's very difficult for you to plan the whole delivery without knowing what is the most critical for them. So when you start it, I would recommend to always understand what is a North Star, why are we doing it, how we are doing it, what we are doing, where we are doing it. Basically identify all of the stages, all of the personas who will be using it, and all of the user journeys, how they will be using it, either it's internal or external users, either it's your customers. And also it's very important to understand how they will use it. Because sometimes maybe there are some departments who you might not feel that they're a really big part of the change. So for example, very often like legal department, I noticed, or finance department who are not really the top of the priority of some of the changes I've done. But then actually there was a major bottlenecks and they absolutely put a stop to everything. So they might be only using it for 1 or 2% of their time. But some of the changes which they will be requesting are absolutely critical for the business. So some of them, as an example, we had to implement the split payments, and we couldn't take basically the whole payment immediately. We had to make the split payments as we were taking the payment for tax reasons, because otherwise they will be out of business essentially. And that stakeholder was not really prioritized, and we didn't talk to them in the beginning. And at the point where we started talking to them, we realized that that was a massive change. First of all, we had to amend completely the contracts with the payment vendor. And secondly, the technology, how to actually make this change was very complex. It wasn't so easy to implement. And it created, again, like obviously some of the delay within our work. So it's important to understand from everyone kind of point of view what is important and how actually they see it working from their perspective, who are users who will be using it. And at the same time, it's really important to understand what value we are trying to deliver and how they're going to use it later on this change, whether it's sustainable or not, and how they're going to assess it as well. So I noticed that with, again, many of my clients in the past. So I used to work for Adobe Commerce, and when I was working for Adobe Commerce, you will hear a lot of customers who are coming from Salesforce and will say like, oh, Salesforce is really bad, it didn't work for us for certain reasons. And then when I started working for Salesforce, we had exactly the same, like customers would come from Adobe Commerce and say, oh, Adobe Commerce is really bad, and basically you hear exactly the same feedback. So the issue is not the platform which you're using most of the time. It's more that the initial assessment was not done properly, and then adoption probably also had some issues within it that eventually lead to lots of issues, and people are then again trying to switch to something else in the future. So science of Dyn project and program, there can be many of them. I just put some of like kind of the most common. Most of the time when you're delivering it, I would say you don't really have from your delivery perspective as much of influence on it, but I think it's important to realize it and to notice it as soon as you see that something is basically sliding off the rail, because many of them can be fixed if you basically highlight it to the stakeholders, and stakeholders will be aware of it. Because again, you might assume that, well, maybe they know it, or maybe there's no kind of solution to it and they were completely aware of it. But certain stakeholders might actually have more power to influence certain decisions, and for them it might be really important. So I would say just go through understanding the business priorities, and they always shift. So kind of always talk to all of the stakeholders to understand if it's still the same as you originally agreed, if it's changing, to understand where exactly it's changing and how it will impact the whole delivery. Very common, which also happens, is if the main champions either left the company or will move to something else. So especially if it's like maybe like the key architect or key stakeholder who was the most involved in it. Also, a lot of changes are usually happening if you're using different vendors, and maybe there was some key vendor and they have many changes on their side, either it's management changes or resources changing. So you need to be very proactive then how do you actually address it, because it will create a lot of issues and some bottlenecks down the line. So just prepare like how you will address it before it will create some issues. Budgets. So budgets, I think, is also very common because of the cost of the transformations is so massive, and because the business priorities are constantly changing. So it's very common for budgets to get reduced, or basically they were expecting to get additional funding, but they didn't get it. So it's important to basically keep forecasting for the future and always see where you are already with your budget spent and where you might be in the future. And if you see any changes, kind of how can you address, like, and again, then discuss it with the holders. So whether maybe something needs to be dropped, or maybe you need to switch priority on something else based on it, or maybe they can find some workaround with it. So coming to the actual delivery, it's important to understand within all stakeholders what they want to do from the business perspective and also from the personal perspective. So I would always recommend to start with building personal relationship with everyone, especially with the key stakeholders. So trying to understand basically from more selfish perspective, what's in it for me, and kind of present it to each different stakeholder what this transformation can deliver to them, because they might have the idea on the high level, but they might not be aware in the details, like how actually it can help them. So you might help them to increase commissions or to reduce the manual work, or to increase customer like satisfaction or conversion rate or whatever it is. So if they see it more like in numbers, it will help them to be more involved in the change, especially because all of the stakeholders, they will have other work to do, and usually they're very busy, and for transformations to keep moving slow, basically nicely, you will have lots of questions and dependencies on other stakeholders, and they need to understand the sense of urgency, that if you're asking them to provide some help or some data or whatever that you need, that it needs to be done as soon as possible, or based on like some timeline, if you have like certain deadline by what they need to provide it. So they will actually allocate resources to deliver it to you, because otherwise it's very easy to create lots of delays and people just will lose kind of interest in it. So I would say this is the most critical part of the discovery, is just trying to build this overall understanding from all of the parties how they can help and why it will be helpful for them. Then try to identify the stakeholders which can be the most supportive to you, who will have some power within the organization, and also if you will struggle in the future with some of the issues or whatever that is, that they can basically back up you and they can provide you additional support. Then also engaged all of the key specialists from the start, so especially like architects or anyone basically within the company to whom the change is addressing, even if it's, again, as I mentioned before, even if you don't think they're going to be the main users for the change, they might be actually the most important people. So as another example within my change, which we were doing, is that insurance stakeholders, they basically put a plug to our launch plans because they realized that know your customer had to be done as the first step within the user journey, not later on as we planned, because from their perspective, it was creating lots of risks and issues if we took already a lot of the data, we kind of make already some promises to the clients, and then what we are promising to them we might not be able to promise. And also it gives kind of the already view to the customers what they might see or use. So they didn't want it to be basically the case. So we had again to change the whole kind of user flow, which is again important to involve all of the stakeholders from the start, and to understand how they see it from their point of view. Then create a momentum. This is, I think, the most important. So everyone needs to be very excited of the change. Basically, always keep everyone informed what is happening, why it's happening, show them some quick wins. So it's very common for transformations like to last for years. And if people don't see anything for 2 or 3 or 4 years, they will lose interest. And then you can kind of bring the sense of urgency, and then it's very easy just basically to stop progress at all with the transformation. So I know that one of the companies whom I worked with, they had one transformations which lasted for 2 years. It was very long, very painful, and at the end, because they just had to close it, the stakeholders lost interest completely. They didn't present any like kind of quick wins. So basically they were looking at it as the long-term goal, and they wanted to deliver everything at once at the end. So by the time it was coming, like everyone just moved on and they found some other smaller solutions how they were addressing these issues. People were not interested. So I think unless you're building it more in iterative approach and you can identify like some small wins, how you can deliver it quickly and start using it within the business, it's very difficult to keep the momentum going. Always start basically with why with each of the stakeholder, understand why they want this, how it will help. And it's also very important to create the opportunity to try and fail, because again, the transformations are very big. So you might think that this is how your customers are going to use it or how your colleagues are going to use it. But in reality, people will start using it in completely different ways. So unless you launch it fast, you don't know how they will be working with it. So before you've spent too much time and money on something that might not be completely usable, or it will be working in different ways how you expect it, it's much more important to basically release fast, fail fast, so then you can get immediate feedback and you improve as you go. So you can either identify your certain department who can be very happy, approachable to try this change, or maybe it's just certain people who will be using it, or maybe just certain like one client, or like maybe some small area location who will be again like happy to kind of go through this opportunity with you and give you immediate feedback, and then you know whether you're progressing as you were expecting or not, and you can implement the changes. Then moving on to discover and kind of still within define phase. So I think governance is the most important. So I would say there's always two parts to it. One is program governance, another is data governance. So program governance, usually everyone is talking a lot about it. So at least you have some understanding about your steering committee. You need to identify some success criteria, but also it needs to be really clear success criteria and some set KPIs. Sometimes it's very high level, so it's difficult then to know once you actually launched it, did you actually meet your criteria or not? So I would always try to push back and to make business think what actually they want to achieve in numbers. So then we have something like how we can assess it later on where we are. And the most fun part of the governance, I think, is roles and responsibilities and setting accountability. It's very common where businesses have reluctance to actually take the ownership authority for certain tasks. And someone needs to be accountable. Someone needs to make decisions. Sometimes you need decisions on the fly. Sometimes you need this. Still, someone needs to be accountable for it. And you know that if you're asking this person, you can rely on their answers. And I noticed that this is usually the most difficult part of the basically governance. People usually don't want to take the accountability, especially if it's big organizations. There's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of kind of fear that no one wants to be accountable for that. If something will go wrong, they don't want to be that person. But then for you to deliver it, it's impossible because you will have so many questions that you need to answer. You will need additional resources, you will need time from people. So someone will need to be that person who will be able to do it from the business perspective. And if there's no such person, then you will have really big delays and it's not going to help anything. So then you see a lot of transformation can roll for the next few years, and some of them just never finish. So yeah, always start with trying to understand basically who is accountable, who should be consulted, who should be informed within the business. It's very important also to set the change basically authority board and who should be on that board to avoid any scope creep. Again, because the transformations are so big and there's so many changes within organizations that are going to happen, scope creep is the most common that will happen most likely. Everyone will try to push their own kind of agenda, and obviously it's important for their department, but is it important overall for the whole like change for the business? So that's why you need change authority board from the start, and if any changes are coming, always address it immediately from that board and then see how it will impact the whole delivery. Sometimes it's very easy to adapt and it's what is needed. Sometimes it's very difficult to adapt and it might be not needed at all. There might be some other workarounds that are possible to implement. So basically, change authority board will be there to kind of understand all of the risks and actions needed from that point of view. Availability, I would say this is always the key, and communication plan. So because the key stakeholders are always going to be busy and you will need their time. So I will always suggest to allocate and agree some of the ways how you will communicate to them. So maybe it will be once a week or a few times a day, and you just basically block the amount of time that you can always come to them at this certain amount of time and cover all of the issues that you have. Because otherwise, again, it can create a lot of the delays within the business. And then escalation plan. So because again, it's such a massive work which is going to be done. There are going to be issues, and some of the decisions will be very difficult to make. So you need to have a clear escalation plan for someone, how to basically address it. So if something is going to happen, who is the person who can answer it? Or maybe people are going to be sick or on holiday. Again, like who will be able to replace them so we are not going to be delayed, and who will be able to address all of the questions or issues. And then coming to the data governance, I think this is platform and data governance. That's the one area which I noticed that usually create a lot of the issues and a lot of the delays. And most of the time, surprisingly, it's very underestimated. There's a lot of assumption, I think, by business generally that it will just happen by itself. But in reality, it takes a lot of the time and effort from everyone. And I don't know, if you worked before with the data, especially if you're like migrating from one platform to another, to move everything for one place, it takes a lot of time. Very often you notice that data is located in completely different locations, so there's no basically one source of truth. The data quality is also can be very low, and there's no data standards. So for example, name can be presented in completely different formats, or the same kind of maybe data can be like numbers or words. So then when you're trying to consolidate all of this data, it's very difficult to work with it. So it's important to understand metrics, how you're going to monitor it, to set up security from all of the compliance, from the compliance perspective, any GDPR or like California law, California consumer law, and there's also Australian and a few other compliance like FCA regulations and a few more. So also it's important to have a clear plan for archiving and removal of data. So again, when you're doing the digital transformations, at certain point you will come to what actually you're going to do with the old data. Are you going to remove it? Are you going to archive it? Are you going to restore some of it? So basically have a clear plan and understanding how actually it will work for you in the future, and also who is the owner of the data and who is the users. And the policies, basically who needs to have access to the data, how they will use it, what platforms needs to be access to the data, how you're going to know from which platform the data is coming, how you're going to trace it. And there's a lot of work which actually needs to be done. And I will say this is very underestimated area most of the time, because it's very difficult to put a number on it unless you know exactly what the company is working on with and where you're moving on. So I would always recommend trying to understand what technologies the company already using, what technologies you are moving on, what the data formats that data needs to be in. So try to ask maybe for some examples, so to provide, so then trying to understand the data flows, and also if anything is going to change based on what you had before and how it will be in the future. And then trying to understand how many people are going to be involved in this process and who actually can help you with it. So also data governance is very important for you to move to AI. So we noticed that some of my big clients, like they came to us and they were asking like why we're not doing anything for them, why there are no plans in terms of the AI. And that basically was one of the answers that we provided, that unless we work on their data, which was they accumulated like so much data. It was like over like 15 or 20 years worth of data. A lot of it was in completely different formats, some structured, some unstructured. So AI won't be able to work with it at all. So if you actually want to, again, move towards AI, you need to have really good data governance in place. And also, it's not something that you're just doing it once. Once you basically launch, it has to be an ongoing process. So someone needs to be allocated to work on the data, to check that what data you're still collecting, if it's still the same, addressing all of your kind of policies, or if something needs to be done and changed, again, you will accumulate in the future again lots of data. Even that you made some cleanup in the past, you might need to do some of the cleanup again. It's possible to set up some of the automation rules and so on, but again, it takes a lot of time and you can do some metrics and monitoring and alerts. But again, it only adds more complexity to it. So business really needs to provide more guidance of what exactly they're expecting from it and how they're planning to use it in the future. So then during the adoption is not going to be some of the issues, because even within AI, for example, we noticed some of the clients who actually launched it. Originally it was fine, but then eventually it kind of AI stopped giving as correct answers as in the beginning, mainly because of the data quality, because no one was basically looking at the data. And it's really easy for AI then to get biased, to get lost in insane amount of data, and then basically you're not getting as correct answers as you originally had it. So moving on to the planning, around the planning, it's really important to have a clear vision and roadmap and identify all of the dependencies and key milestones. So sometimes when I talk to some of the like either to the business or to some of the development teams, you can hear some of the feedbacks well, but it's impossible to build the roadmap for such a long kind of timeline. But still, you can't really know how to address the change, how to plan, if you don't know what actually you're expecting in the future. Otherwise, you will just run out of money, run out of your stakeholders' resources, and it will all collapse. So it's important to start basically from scratch, kind of do some high-level roadmap. What are the main kind of targets we are trying to achieve? What are our dependencies within other departments, within other technologies, or maybe within our different vendors? Identify key milestones. Again, try to be split it into smaller stages. So how we can deliver it, what is the first value we can deliver. So focus on the smaller steps rather than like big junk, because then it will be easier to split it into the roadmap and to actually see and identify the milestones. And also, I think, try to always estimate and re-estimate the work as you go along, because then you will know more what you already know, what you didn't know before. And as everything is changing, so then estimations might change as well. I would always recommend to set contingency, and basically based on the risks and how much you know, you always have to increase the contingency. So for example, maybe if you have a vendor who is very difficult to work with, or maybe if there are many different vendors involved, you should increase the contingency really a lot, just because most likely you will have lots of issues, either it's communications or some during the delivery, but something will be coming as an issue during the delivery. So just put a lot of time just in case. And then also try to push all of the stakeholders to identify your MVP, actual MVP, because most of the time when we are talking to the businesses, I notice that they will come to you and they say, well, this is our MVP. And then if you actually dig more into it, you will realize that half of it might be removed and they will be still happy with it. Again, because the transformations are so massive, if you focus on everything that you want to achieve, it will be very difficult to achieve. If you try with smaller steps, it will be way more easier to achieve it, and it will be way more successful. So I also noticed that it's very common for companies to come with, then at the end, like you build the MVP with them, then you notice that it's impossible to deliver it, then you create an MVP of MVP. Sometimes we had to create MVP of MVP of MVP. So obviously that original MVP wasn't an MVP. And that's why it's important to kind of push back sometimes stakeholders and really make them focus what is really important, because usually if you dig more into it, you will realize that you can deliver less, and it will be basically, it will cover their needs, as essential needs. And then once you actually launch, then you can basically add more stuff into it and work on it. But then already you have something to work on. You will have the feedback from the business, you will have feedback from the customer, so it will be much easier to build on top of it, rather than trying to build some one big solution that might be not needed at the end in few years. Coming to the design and deploy stage, I mean, this I would say is still going through all of the phases. I wouldn't say it's only happening through this stage, but it's probably more important during the stages. You need to invest in people, and as soon as possible, because again, training takes a lot of time. You can create some support groups within your business. You need to identify your early adopters. So basically, these are the people who are very happy to try something new. They have some influence within the organization. So maybe they have a lot of reputation, or they've been within the company for a very long time. So people will actually listen to them. So they can influence people to try something new. They can champion the change. Another one is very important, I would say, is continuous visible support from the C-suite. This is something which also I noticed within some of my transformations which I've done, that initially C-suite was very involved, and then they kind of lost interest. They moved on to other more important tasks, kind of thinking, well, people know already what they're doing, so they don't need to be involved as much. But then what's happening within your delivery is that people start thinking, well, maybe what we are doing is not important for the business. So if business is not chasing it, business is not present, like on maybe show and tells and so on. So why do we actually need to work so hard on it? Why do we need to focus on it? Maybe we can just do something else as well from our side. So then you start losing people. So you kind of, the whole kind of momentum is lost completely. So we'll always suggest, if you notice that C-suite is getting too distracted with something else, at least to drag them back at certain points, maybe during the show and tells, or maybe like once a month or whatever, like that can be like, so just people at least see that, yes, they're still interested, they're still here. Obviously, they're busy with other more important tasks, but it's still very important for the business to actually do it. And then it's really critical, I think, to celebrate like milestones, small wins, and to show your progression, because otherwise people don't see what actually is happening. If they don't see it, they might completely forget about it, or they kind of lose trust on it. And then it will be very difficult with adoption, because people are not waiting for it. They don't care about it. But if you make some celebrations, make some events out of it, even small ones within your team or within your department, or maybe on the company level, depends the size of your organization and the change, it will be way more acceptable later on once it's actually ready. And then coming to the adoption and to the actual deployment, so the interesting part that you only need to implement the change within like 15 or 18% of your business to make it successful. But for that, you need to build all of that excitement, momentum, and you need to have your influential people. And if you have this small number of people already using your new technology, others basically will tag along. They will be interested. Oh, why it's working for you? What is there? Like, can we also try? And then you see that other departments start using it as well. And basically, it's just sharing. The success is more shared across the business. So it's very common for the business, I would say, to celebrate too early. And basically, we see it every time. Like, you see like on LinkedIn, on some like events where you will see that, oh, we've done some amazing digital transformations. We launched and it's amazing, it's working great. But then apparently that for the change to stick, you need to spend at least 2 or 4 years for it to adapt and for people to get used to it. And that's something that also we noticed with some of our clients who are coming back later to us and saying, well, now it's not working, we are not happy. And apparently it's more the adoption failed. So basically, you need to still working on it. You need to see how people are using it. Are they facing any issues? Do they need additional training? Maybe the technology is too difficult. maybe the needs changed, so maybe we need to make some of the changes within technology. Most of the time technology can address it, but people were not aware of it. So this is also very common that we see it where they will come back to you and say like, well, technology is not working, we don't want to use it anymore. But actually they were not aware that it was possible to do what they wanted to do with what they struggled. They just didn't have enough knowledge or expertise in it. And from the technology perspective, for people who are actually delivering it and then doing the handover of it, for people who actually use it, there always needs to be someone who is the owner of it, who basically will always create this new excitement around the technology, even if it's not new anymore. What else can be done? Because with most of them, the possibilities are really big. It just people don't know how to use it. Then it's important to plan for post-launch and basically to create all of your maintenance plan, SLA support. Some of them might be reused based on what you had before. Some of them might be not possible to use and you need to make substantial changes. Sometimes you need to hire new people. And this is also very common, which I noticed with some of my clients, where they realized that only basically around the launch date, where they realized that they actually had to hire new people. They didn't have enough resources within their business to run the new change which we were launching. So then we had to wait with the launch until they had enough resources on their side. Create basically backup plan. So if something will go wrong, either during the deployment or after deployment, how you're going to address it. Maybe you need to move back to your previous technology for a short time. Whatever that is, basically based on your changes which you're making, there always has to be a backup plan and you need to address it way before you're actually launching it. Set up alerts. I think this is also very underestimated item because setting alerts usually takes a lot of the time and effort, and sometimes even you need some additional technologies and tools for it, and the cost as well. And if you don't notice that something is going wrong within your technologies which we're using, it can be absolutely critical. So also it's common, like with some of my clients, we noticed that we didn't build some of the alerts because kind of business didn't ask for it, but also because there was so much like hassle that we actually had to address a delivery date. That once then we launched it, some of the issues were missed basically because the alert was not set for it. And it was a very basic one, I would say. So always kind of plan it in advance and make sure that business also understands what was said from the technology perspective, what was not said, and how much time it will take and money for it. This because usually just very often it's not included, and then it creates issues in the future. Create ramp-up plan, again, just to help with adoption. So like kind of long-term and short-term, like how people can use it. Maybe join some communities, like do like some face-to-face meetings with, or like remote meetings with people who are actually using this technology to see how they're using it from their side, how it works with other businesses, so you can learn more lessons from them. And the most important, I will say, also documentation, which is very often is what is completely missed because you're making so many changes. You either create it on the very high level or it's not kind of, it's going to miss some of the important steps which you might think now it's not important. But then after you launch, you actually need the documentation because all of the champions which were working on your projects, they might be moving on completely out of your company or completely to different either maybe they were from the vendor side or they will be working on something else, and they will also forget with time what they've done as well from their side as well. And then you will need to upgrade it maybe in the future. You maybe need to teach some new players how to work with it, and that's basically where a lot of issues then come to. The documentation was not clear, and it's not clear how to actually work with that new technology which you implemented. So basically, coming to the last point, wrapping it up, I would say that it's important to understand that the change is constant. You're not going to stop once it's launched. You need to really prioritize adoption. You need to allocate your resources, your time, your budget for it, and it has to be probably much more than originally you were expecting. Trying to also understand how much it will cost for you to upgrade and to support your system. This is again very common, especially from the business, because they might not have the clear view what technologies, how much upgrade needs to happen, how often, and how long it takes. So before you actually going to hand over it for someone who will be the owner of it, it's important to basically walk through the upgrade and maintenance and support, how much time it takes, so that it's actually allocated for your future like roadmap. And my favorite one is probably the assumptions. So basically, don't make any assumptions, especially within your deliveries. I will say assumption caused the most of the issues with miscommunications between different departments and stakeholders, where you just thought that, and I was also had issues with assumptions as well. And that's very common, where business assume that the technology will do this. You assume that they were aware of it, and then just lots of issues just building on top of it. So basically, always double check everything. Create a list of what you think is going to happen, what people know, or what they might do, and make everyone aware that this is what is going to happen. So basically, avoid all of the assumptions as much as possible. Identify resources which are needed, constantly engage with the C-suite to understand how the business are changing, and also engage them with your transformation, and make the iterative change by building demand, kind of slowly building demand rather than make one big bang. I guess that's probably all from my side. Do you have any questions?
I was going to say thank you, Alina. Covered a lot there. Great summary at the end. We've got a comment from Rachel, but no questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I had a question. So a lot of, so I think some of the things that you've talked about there in terms of governance, I think would also apply to non-digital transformation. Yeah. So, but I almost get the impression you just need even more of it. What would you say are the key challenges that are unique to digital transformation?
For digital, I would say data governance and platform governance. This more unique because this is usually because majority of stakeholders with whom you're usually working, they're not technical. And it's important to involve more technical if they exist within the company. Sometimes they don't exist, and then you just need to walk through with your main stakeholders and to make them aware of what is there, because very often they're not aware that it's just such a massive chunk of work and someone needs to be doing it, and explain all of the risks which are going around it, because yeah, especially the security and compliance. Because usually you see that companies are focusing a lot on the compliance, so there's a lot of which is not around the technology side. But then how do you translate it into the technology world? And that's where a lot of the issues are coming from. And that's what I noticed a lot, because usually when you're working on the digital transformations, legal team is usually not involved at all, or involved as the last step, but they will put a plug completely to everything what you're doing if you've done something wrong. But they're not technical people, and sometimes you need to help them a lot how to work with the technology, because they might know what is legal or not legal, but obviously they don't know how it looks in the technology. How do you store the data? Who can access the data? Also, is it possible to do some checks on the technology side? So some of the examples where I worked with a legal team, where they came to us and they asked, well, apparently we needed, for the FCA regulations, we need to make sure that whatever basically we are providing to the customers, that they don't have any mental health issues. And this was very difficult to implement from the technology perspective. So we did set up certain kind of calls. So basically, we'll put some notifications in place that if we have new customers, especially if they're older than certain age, where it's more likely that they might have some issues, that basically the team will be flagged, and then they will have to call basically to the customer and kind of try to talk to them to get the idea if they're mentally stable or not. because some of the companies, if they're going to sell something to someone, for example, who has domain share, they can be fined millions. And it's very often basically a missed step, which then you have to implement, and it causes a lot of the issues at the end for the companies, and many of the businesses are actually failing because of something basic like this. Yeah. So I would say just involve all of the stakeholders, especially the key critical one, like accountant, finance, legal, try to understand from their perspective. Manufacturing, depends what is your business. Try to understand what can be the issue, and then how you can actually implement it within what you're doing, because they also need some guidance basically with what you're trying to implement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, there's one in the chat maybe. No, I thought that might be a question coming from Alexandra. So we'll leave it there. Obviously, there's a QR code there to connect with Alina if there's anything to follow up offline. If not, thank you for everyone coming today. Thank you, Alina, for the content that you've shared and for all the experience that you've shared with us. And yeah, have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.